Many people outside of, let's say, the YouTube or the online circles of my life often ask me, why don't you just let certain conflicts go? And we're talking about conflict that can range as far back as, let's say, maybe even 20 years, right? Well, here's the thing about it. If you choose to live in a world of cowardice, fakeness, and the path of least resistance, that's on you. I live in a real world where I'd rather beat my opponents to an absolute submission. And when I mean opponents, I mean in any type of opposition in life, whether that's in business, whether that's in the streets, or whether that's in anything that I do with whatever competitive field that I'm going to engage in. That is the reality of my life. And quite frankly, I would assume that is the reality of most people's lives in one form or another. So you're probably wondering, how does this relate to WrestleMania weekend and this particular fight week being a little bit more lackluster on the boxing world and even more so in the MMA world, considering that UFC 300 is just about almost a week away? Well, here's the thing about this, right? If you grew up as a wrestling fan, more than likely you transitioned later on as an MMA fan. Now, why is that? For one, I think there's a level of perception that we got as kids that pro wrestling offered a sense of realism in terms of sometimes escaping real life, right? And that's sort of what was offered to us in the 1980s and 90s. And when you grew up, especially in my age group, okay, especially if you were a fan of D Generation X, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, all these particular figures, even the NWO era, which by the way was a very interesting transition. Now, as you remember, NWO Hulk Hogan was one of the biggest bad guys to have ever existed in the world of professional wrestling. But at the same time, before that, he was also the biggest good guy and the greatest hero that the pro wrestling world has ever seen. So as a result, he sort of managed to become these two figures in two different eras and represent two different sides of himself. But in reality, it was a representation of the realness that is inside all of us. Or better yet, the yearning for realness that we look for. You can even see this in the hip hop world. I'll give you an example. Many of us grew up thinking that a lot of our famous rappers that we grew up admiring were heroes and that they were the biggest gangsters in the world. But lo and behold, let's talk about Tupac, for example. Many people don't like to admit that this guy was violated in prison when he was locked up in Rikers Island. How do I know this? John Singleton was going to do a documentary on Tupac Shakur's prison time in New York and document his rape allegations, him being shot, etc., and all these other stories that are tied to him, only to find out in the medical records that he was violated, by the way, in a grape type of matter, for lack of a better term, to not get demonetized on YouTube or to get flagged in any kind of way. But yeah, he was raped in prison, and there's medical records to show that. And as a result, they decided to pull the plug on this particular content based on the fact that it made Tupac look less of a man that we had perceived him to be. Now, it doesn't change the fact that he makes great music. It doesn't change the fact that many people are going to ignore the realities of that particular incident in his life and would rather just concentrate on, oh, the positive side of things, the positive side of things, which brings me to pro wrestling. You see, pro wrestling offers this to you, and you're probably wondering, why am I doing a pro wrestling commentary content during WrestleMania week, and yet I barely even kept up with the storylines other than seeing a few clips of Cody Rhodes getting beat up by The Rock? Well, I'll tell you why. Because I think that there's some correlation to understanding how, let's say, guys my age, mid 30s, above, past 40s, that were part of that D Generation X era, or that Generation X era, or whatever you want to call it, millennials, or whatever era you can classify that as. that went from watching wrestling to being disgruntled by the fakeness of it all, only to transition into MMA. Because let's face it, wrestling is always going to constantly give you what you want, which is what? Absolute fakeness. And by the way, this is exactly what The Rock represents in all forms of ways. This guy comes into the UFC selling his shoes, forcing the other fighters to wear it without giving them proper compensation for the commercialization and the advertisement of his particular product. Now, how fake is that? How about the fact that, now, I'm not the biggest Logan Paul fan in the world, nor do I stand against him strongly, but at the same time, I also condemn what he did when he made that suicide video in Japan, which the world, rightfully so, tried to cancel him for. So as a result of that cancellation, The Rock did the biggest industry move that he can make, which is what? He told Logan Paul, hey, guess what? I don't want you to be part of any of my products. I don't want you to be my social media friend. I don't want anything to do with you. Okay, now how fake is that? Because guess what? I got friends, homies in California all the way to New Jersey, New York, and even up to Europe and the Middle East that would ride for me in whatever it is that I do, so long as it doesn't violate certain principles that would be out of the norm in the ethos that we live by. Whereas with The Rock, he embodies everything that is about professional wrestling. He's fake. He will try to politic into getting onto the top, meaning that he'll stab you in the back behind the scenes in the locker rooms and anything that he can do to get there. But guess what? When you're in any industry, it's really like that. But there are exceptions to a few people. And I'm not going to mention any names or give clout to any particular person or somehow make them a subject matter of this particular video. But understand that there is a difference between people that stand on business and people that are just all about the business no matter what and will protect their business even if they have to be fake about it. But that is the reason why a lot of people have transitioned from being wrestling fans in the 80s and 90s and becoming MMA fans later on in their life. Because what is it that MMA offers that the world of professional wrestling doesn't? For one, it offers realness in the metaphorical sense, in the physical sense, but also in the sense of everything that deals with the culture surrounding that particular business. And what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at the contrasting cultures of wrestling versus MMA. In the world of MMA, there is a real culture within the gyms. I gotta tell you, when you go to any boxing gym, MMA gym, it is the only place where you can literally see a combination of cops, criminals, the rich and the poor, and people of different races and different ethnic backgrounds and contrasting tribal politics mingling together, all in the name of either getting healthy, getting better, or to learn self-defense. Whereas in the world of professional wrestling, every move that you make from the person that you ride with from one town to another, on top of the fact that you have to somehow appease a man on top, which is Vince McMahon, some of the most vile human being that has ever existed. I mean, you got to think to yourself, this is the reality of that particular world. And how do you get around it? How did The Rock become who he was? He did exactly all these things. Now, this is not in any way to throw shade at The Rock or to somehow display any sense of jealousy at all. I would not want his life. Nobody does. And this idea that because you want to criticize somebody that you're a hater or because somehow you are jealous of them or you want their life, listen, let's be honest about this particular narrative that people like to spew about that particular subject. Everybody wants a good life, but it doesn't mean that you want to do it exactly as the next guy. Every rich guy has their own way of wanting to be rich. For example, some people like boats. Maybe some people like cars. Maybe some people like newer cars. Some people like classic cars. It all depends on what you can afford and what you're willing to do. And that is really the difference between what you're trying to do in terms of accomplishments and in terms of what it is that you want out of life. So everybody wants a good life. But this idea that because you're jealous of a person, because you criticize them of their certain actions, it's absolute nonsense. And by the way, this is the type of narrative that they spew in the world of professional wrestling. And again, this is not to throw shade in professional wrestling in any kind of way, because guess what? It's WrestleMania, right? And as somebody who grew up watching WrestleMania, WWE, Royal Rumble, WCW, NWO, ECW, and all these things, transitioning from that to a teenager, from a kid, a teenager to an adulthood as an MMA fan and as an MMA practitioner, it's worth noting that I'm probably going to watch WrestleMania just for the heck of it. I mean, let's just be honest. There's no bigger fight this weekend than the biggest fight of them all, which, by the way, is nothing more than a fake fight. But why is that? The main thing that I want you to understand is that sometimes we want a little bit of an escape from reality. And that is literally what the world of professional wrestling offers. But when life gets real, and when you're in situations where you're living in a world of conflict, you're living in a world of, let's say, hardships, things become so real to the point where you are just absolutely disgruntled with watching all this fake stuff. And then something resonates that's real with you, which is what? Mixed martial arts. The realness of the competitive architecture, the realness of the culture within the gyms, and the people that are surrounding those gyms, and the ethos that these people live by. But whereas in the world of professional wrestling, it is nothing more than a world of people trying to get over each other behind the scenes. And of course, the entertainment aspect of it and the physical sense of it, you're literally hurting yourself just for a fake entertainment and for, by the way, nothing more than a subjective opinion of the owner, the producers, and the promoters of that particular sport. So in other words, there have been guys that have been really put in the back seat for over the years just because, let's say, well, I'm about to pull out some WWE history on you guys. So if you remember, Chris Jericho for a long time was very disgruntled with with WCW, which, by the way, led him to the WWE. Why? Because he was overlooked with the skills that he had displayed, the international experience that he has gained from wrestling to Japan to Mexico and doing all different types of styles within professional wrestling, from the luchador style to the strong style Japanese style to the American style, and to cultivating his own style, that he was overlooked by people that were, let's say, just really either on demand or people that were just pushed in front of your face at the time, which was the NWO, the NWO Wolfpack, and Hulk Hogan, and all these other guys that really were put over him based on the fact of politics, not based on the fact of competitive architecture or competitive integrity, but rather the world of someone's subjective opinion. And by the way, this is the type of world that The Rock lives in. He lives in a world of subjective opinion. He lives in a world of fake positivity. Oh, I'm this guy. I wake up this time in the morning, or this and that. You know, where were you at? 4 a.m. in the morning. Okay, that's all great. All this hustle culture BS. All that is great. But the thing is, you honestly have to do that all the time to show people that you wake up in the morning, to show how disciplined you are. Maybe that helps a lot of people. But at the same time, why do you need some big steroid idiot who, by the way, is nothing more than a fake human being, a disbeliever? On top of that, a guy who politics worse than anybody in Hollywood or in the world of professional wrestling, and creates his own narrative to somehow win your hearts through subjective opinion. And that's just the reality of pro wrestling in a nutshell. So please understand where I'm coming from with this particular aspect. It's not to hate professional wrestling in any way. I'm actually going to watch it for the spectacle. And not only that, it also gives you a certain level of reminders and reminiscing on your childhood, especially if you grew up watching this particular product. But more importantly, here's something I need you to understand to really understand the thesis of this whole entire video. We live in a world of realness and we yearn for it, but sometimes there is a world of escape that we are looking for, and this is exactly what this particular product offers. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I will see you guys soon in the next content, inshallah.